Good afternoon. My name is Stephen Sloan. I'm the director of the Institute for Oral History at Baylor University and an associate professor of history in the Department of History here at Baylor. And I want to welcome you to our virtual panel, 100 Years of Preserving Voters' Rights. We are holding it today on September 22nd because it is National Voter Registration Day. And so we're going to begin today and end today by encouraging all within our voice to register to vote and to participate in the political process. We're also holding this event this year because last month we recognized August 18th, 1920. We looked back at the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which outlawed denying the right to vote to citizens on the basis of sex. We see the 19th Amendment, my presenters here with me, as a signal achievement, but also an unfinished revolution. And we're going to talk about it in those different ways. Oftentimes, we commemorate and recognize at these 100th anniversaries, but we don't take times to look at the complexities and all the different angles of how it needs to be understood. For this, we brought in a great panel. And that great panel was assembled through the sponsors that we have for the event today. I want to begin by thanking our sponsors. That's the W.R. Pogue Legislative Library, the Institute for Oral History here at Baylor, Women and Gender Studies at Baylor, and Waco NAACP. I will start by introducing our illustrious panel that's going to present to us today. We're going to try a little bit of a different format. So if you don't like one speaker, you're going to hear another speaker here in just a second. And so I'd like to invite my panelists to join me on video here for a second for introductions. I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they will present. So Dr. Andrea Turpin will be our first presenter. She is an associate professor of history here at Baylor University. She's very well published. Her first book has won multiple awards. A New Moral Vision, Gender, Religion, and the Changing Purposes of Higher Education, 1837 to 1917. It's a Cornell University Press publication. It explores how the entrance of women into U.S. colleges and universities shaped changing ideas about the moral and religious purposes of higher education, and in turn, profoundly shaped American culture. Dr. Turpin has also served as a co-chair of the Higher Education Affinity Group of the History of Education Society, and serves on the Council of the American Society of Church History. She contributes to the group blog, The Anxious Bench, and she also tweets at Andrea Turpin on Twitter. You can find her there. Dr. Peaches Henry is our second presenter today. She is in her second term as president of the Waco NAACP. She is a professor at McLennan Community College, where she teaches both composition and British literature. She's a member of the Waco Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta sorority, whose first act after its founding in January 1913 was to march in the Women's Suffrage Parade in March of 1913. So quite a connection here. She is a member of the United Way's Community Grant-Making Task Force, the Waco Leadership Forum, the Advisory Committee of First National Bank, and the Board of Greater Waco Legal Services. Dr. Henry graduated from the University of Texas in Austin with 2 bachelor degrees, one in education and one in liberal arts. She also has a master's and a doctorate in English and comparative literature from New York's Columbia University. So welcome, Dr. Henry. Our third presenter is Dr. Christina Chan-Park. She serves as the STEM library coordinator at Baylor University, where she is currently a research librarian for physical sciences and data. Her current research interests are in scholarly communications, specifically data management, academic identity, and bibliometrics. In addition to a master's in information science and a master's in public information, she also has degrees in geology and geophysics from Princeton, Stanford, and the University of British Columbia. She has served as a classroom lecturer at several different institutions, but prior to her coming to Baylor in 2000, she was the director of the NSF-funded Alliance for Graduate Education in the Professorate and was also a visiting professor of geology at the University of Houston. Dr. Chan-Park also currently serves as the president of the League of Women Voters in Waco. Welcome, Dr. Chan-Park. We're going to start by turning to Dr. Turpin and Dr. Henry And they're going to begin by talking about the 19th Amendment, the reason that we're here. It's the best sort of 19 to talk about right now as we're all dealing with other 19s in our lives. And so we're excited to have these experts here to participate with us and to kind of frame this commemoration of the 19th Amendment. And so let's start with Dr. Turpin.
Thank you, Dr. Sloan. I'm delighted to be here with you all this afternoon. This is sort of Women's Suffrage Theme Day for me. I taught this earlier this afternoon on the 19th Amendment, amazingly enough. This is delightfully well-timed in that way. So I wanted to zoom back for us all and talk a little bit about what a significant event this was in American history, but also why it was necessary. And then I'll pass it on to Dr. Henry about how it was unfinished and what happened at that point. So the founders of the nation were trying something really different. When they protested against taxation without representation and oversaw the founding of a republic on this scale. That was new, to have it this big. And it increasingly became a democratic republic, a representative government where more and more and more Americans had a say in that government. And originally it was just land-owning men. And then as the economy changed and fewer people owned land, it became all men, but not really all men. It was all free men. The reason that you originally had to own land was so that no one could control you. The idea was if you depend on your paycheck for somebody else, then they could control your vote. But once more people were employed, they're like, well, it's okay as long as you're the head of a household. And all men were either independent or could be the head of a household. Women were under a law called coverture, where they were either legally under their father or legally under their husband. They couldn't control their own earnings if they had independent earnings. If they owned land, when they got married, that land became in their husband's name. And so they were understood to be too dependent. Their vote could be controlled. And so they did not have the right to vote. But they had the right to contribute to society in other ways. And one of the things that many of these women, along with men in the early American Republic, wanted to contribute to and to help fix was actually the fact that there were both men and women living under slavery in the United States at that time. And so the abolitionist movement attracted many women as well as men. And what ended up happening was they were advocating for freeing slaves, but they ran up into challenges that they couldn't actually advocate as much as they wanted to because they were women. So famously, the American delegation to an international anti-slavery convention in London in 1840, that international convention would not seat the American women as delegates. And so one of those American women delegates who was shunted to the balcony was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, whom you may have heard of, who became a great women's rights advocate in the United States, and also Lucretia Mott, a Quaker woman, who helped politicize her that in order to fight for the rights of others, you also needed to fight for the rights of women. And so the two of them and other women who had the same kinds of experiences in other reform groups got together and formed the first women's rights convention in the United States, Seneca Falls, in 1848. And they wanted to change a whole host of things for women. They wanted to open all the professions to women, to open higher education to women. And they also wanted to get women the vote. It was the most difficult thing to envision at the time and the most controversial as to whether or not they should actually push for it at that moment. What ended up happening briefly was the US Civil War from 1860 to 1865 put a hold on the advocacy for women's rights to focus on the advocacy for rights for African Americans, because this was the moment in American history when all of a sudden there was a genuine possibility that the slaves could be freed. And coming out of the Civil War, that in fact happened, but there was this tension among former abolitionists about whether this was the moment that we could also push legally for the freedom, the political freedom of American women. So there were 3 amendments that came right after the Civil War, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th. The 13th abolished slavery, The 14th granted citizenship to former slaves, and the 15th guaranteed the right to vote for slaves. But the 14th and the 15th Amendment actually only gave citizenship and then clarifying the right to vote to men. So sorry, citizenship for men and women, but they both only gave the right to vote to men. And the split, feminists who were also abolitionists. And some people thought, this is the right moment to just make sure that we can guarantee the vote to African Americans, and others, and we don't want to jeopardize it by trying to also get women's vote, which would in some cases be even more unpopular. And others said, no, we've got to do it now. Susan B. Anthony, the famous feminist, said, if we have that word male in the 14th Amendment, it's going to take us 100 years to get it out. And it didn't take 100, but it did take 50. So she had a point. But so did those who said, no, this is the moment that we really need to focus on Black suffrage. So Frederick Douglass, for example, the famous abolitionist, was also a women's rights advocate. He wanted women's right to vote. But he was on the side of let's be practical, and not just men, but women were also on that side. Let's push for the Black vote first and then for a women's vote. So this kind of disagreement among people who actually did want to see the vote extended to all Americans characterized the continuing challenge to push for women's right to vote. Some people formed a national organization that wanted to do it by having an amendment to the Constitution, which is what ultimately happened. Others wanted to do it state by state, which would have also worked. And they succeeded in getting a lot of Western states to grant women the right to vote before 1920. So the 19th Amendment is actually making it illegal at the federal level for any state to deny women the right to vote. But a few states had already taken that initiative on their own. When you get to the 20th century, you get this continuing split. Those two groups, the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association, merged into the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and they went state by state. They took the more conservative approach. And so a new generation of women came up in the National Women's Party, and they wanted to fight for the national amendment. So they did those together, and they had different tactics. Some of the older women's rights advocates, more conservative, they wanted to just convert the President Woodrow Wilson, to supporting women's right to vote, and to ultimately going ahead and proposing a national amendment, but they were going to go about that slowly. The younger generation, Alice Paul, Lucy Burns, they said, no, we need to push for this now. We need to get those Western women to vote the president out and get in a president who will support women's right to vote right now. And so the group split. And they took different approaches too, in terms of why they believed that women should have the right to vote. The National American Women's Suffrage Association, they emphasized and reached out to the women who actually did see themselves primarily in their identity at the time as homemakers and carers for children. But they thought, things that happen outside the house affect things that happen inside the house. And for me to do a good job of managing my household and caring for my children, I need to be able to vote for sanitary conditions in my city, for good schools. And there was a belief at the time that women had a particular compassionate heart, particular wisdom on how to care for those who were sick, manage households, and the city was like a big household. And so those women wanted to bring their particular wisdom out into the public sphere and help the public sphere. Other women were more strictly egalitarian and said, no, women should have the right to vote, not necessarily because they're different from men and they bring something new, but just because they're human. And these disagreements worked well intentioned. They got a lot of different women on board. Those who opposed women's right to vote were afraid it would split the family, afraid it would fracture society if husbands and wives disagreed and voted differently. So at the same time, more and more women said, though, I do have this particular style of expertise and I do want to vote. And over time, more and more women and some male allies began to support them. And at the end, when the 19th Amendment, Woodrow Wilson was successfully won over, the 19th Amendment was proposed. And It was proposed because some very radical women were willing to go to prison after picketing Woodrow Wilson. They were unpopular, but they were willing to starve themselves in prison to call attention to the cause, and they brought sympathetic media attention. The more moderate women, they rolled bandages to support the soldiers in the World War I at the time. They also got public sympathy for women's support of the country. And it was this combination of women who wanted the vote for different reasons, who had different techniques to fight for it. But together, they brought together a large coalition of Americans who said, you know, that really is just. We really do need women's voices, both because they're individuals and because they bring a different perspective to politics from a different experience, lived in a different body than men do. And so together, they created a large enough coalition that enough states, the 3/4 necessary to amend the Constitution, ratified that 19th Amendment. So that is a signal achievement of getting a lot of people on board from a lot of different type of activists, but it was unfinished. There were women who did not actually end up with the right to vote from the 19th Amendment, and men at the time who couldn't vote as well. And so I want to pass it on to Dr. Henry to talk about how that revolution had to be ongoing.
Thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this panel. So until very recently, the history of the fight for women's suffrage all but ignored the contributions of African-American women and other women of color. And such an omission fails to recognize that the 19th Amendment was eventually passed because of the work of generations of women of all races and backgrounds. Then as now, African-American women saw a good fight, and that fight was the fight for women's suffrage, and they decided to get in it. The leaders of the broader movement, the people whose names we know, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and others, tended to push women of color to the sidelines. They wanted them not to be in the very center of what was going on. And when it came time to write the history of the movement, they whitewashed women of color out of history. So what I want to do is to take a few minutes today to put some color back in the history of the struggle for the passage of the 19th Amendment. And we will talk after our next break about what it meant for women of color and other people after the passage. But throughout the struggle for suffrage, African-American women were always fighting on two fronts: for their rights as African-Americans and also for their rights as women. And because Black women had to, first of all, make a space for themselves to actually join the fight, they had to employ different methods. And so they confronted white women for not wanting them to be a part of the struggle. We are aware of a famous comment by Sojourner Truth as early as 1851. She delivers her famous "Ain't I a Woman" speech at the Ohio Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio. She demands human rights for women as well as for Blacks, and she challenges notions of racial and gender inferiority, and she reminds her audience of her own true womanhood, which is a cultural construct of what women should be, not necessarily one that was accurate, but it did exist. And she was claiming her position in that. We have Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who actually worked with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, but at the same time, she called them out on their racism. So her most famous confrontation came when she spoke at the 1866 National Women's Rights Convention. She says to them, "You white women speak here of rights," calling them out for their lack of female solidarity across racial divides. She says, "I speak of wrongs." And so she is claiming the space to be a part of this movement on behalf of women. Another way that African-American women confronted their lack of inclusion was to actually create their own newspapers, go on their own speaking tours, and even to testify, to speak out on behalf of women. So we have the first Black female law graduate in the United States, who's also the first Black woman in North America to publish a newspaper, in Mary Ann Shadd Cary. And she uses her legal and publishing background to fight for enfranchisement for women. In 1874, she's actually one of several suffragists who testified before the House Judiciary Committee about the importance of the right to vote for women. She remarks that women pay taxes, they're American citizens, and that it is just unjust to deny them access to the ballot box. She says that the crowning history of American citizenship is that it may be shared equally by people of every nationality, complexion, and sex. Now, when Black women are pushed to the sidelines, they go on to found their own suffrage movement. So we have Mary Church Terrell and Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, who co-founded the National Association of Colored Women in 1896. These suffragists become instrumental in consolidating Black suffrage groups across the country. And in 1898, Terrell addresses the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And she says, this is her life's work. Seeking no favors because of our color, nor patronage because of our needs, we knock at the door of injustice, asking an equal chance. And this is my favorite, Ida B. Wells, because Ida B. Wells was one of the founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. 4 years after she helps found the NAACP in 1909, she co-founds the first suffrage movement in Chicago. It is called the Alpha Suffrage Club. And it is a Black women's suffrage organization. Another thing that African American suffrage do is they refuse to be sidelined, and they claim their spot, and in this case, in the literal March for Women's Rights. So when Ida B. Wells and other Black suffragists tried to join the National Suffrage March in DC, they're told by the organizer, Alice Paul, that they need to get to the back of the crowd. Wells refuses. Either I go with you or not at all, she told the organizers. I am not taking this stand because I personally wish for recognition. I am doing it for the future benefit of my whole race. The African American Delta Sigma Theta sorority, founded just 2 months before the march in January, also joined the suffrage march as its first public act of service. And so these women are not the only women. There are more women who work with the suffrage groups up to the 19th passage, but they also work beyond that into the 20th century and into the 26th century. And they see themselves as planting trees that they may never sit beneath, but that future generations will sit beneath. And so I just wanted to bring some of those to your attention, because this was a fight that was conjoined by women from all backgrounds and from all races, and other women of color as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Henry, and thank you, Dr. Turpin, for bringing some deeper understanding to the foundations of the development of the 19th Amendment and the significance of that passage. What's been talked about by both presenters is this is an unfinished revolution, and we should think of it as that. And so there's a long arc in the journey for universal suffrage, and this is not the end of that arc. It's ongoing. And so I want to turn to Dr. Chan-Park to come in and talk a little bit about the 19th Amendment and how it is an unfinished revolution, and just more that they would have to share their perspective on that long arc for universal suffrage. Dr. Chan-Park.
Okay, so while at the federal level, the 19th Amendment granted all the women the right to vote, the states prevented women, together with their husbands, brothers, and fathers, from voting. So at times, less than 1% of the eligible Black voters were registered. And in fact, in some states, Texas being one of them, women's suffrage was actually seen as a way of diluting the minority vote. So in this case, in Texas's case, both Hispanic and Black, by essentially doubling the number of white voters. Of course, this argument sort of assumes that women would vote the same way as their husbands, which in my opinion is not a very good assumption. So it's clear that at the state level, despite the 19th Amendment in practice, not every woman could actually register to vote and then vote. Blacks, for the most part, could not vote. But what about the other minority groups? Their story about the right to vote is tied to their eligibility, not simply to vote, but also to become a citizen. So since I'm Chinese American, I thought I'd start with the Chinese immigrants who sought to become naturalized. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 barred any immigration from China and also denied those already in the US the right to apply for naturalization. So even if they'd been here for decades, they couldn't apply to become citizens. The Page Act in 1875 essentially prohibited Chinese women from entering the US. So the number of US-born Chinese was very low. And these US-born Chinese could be citizens, but the Supreme Court didn't actually rule on that until 1898. And additionally, because of the Expatriation Act of 1907, any US-born Chinese American woman who married a Chinese man or national would lose her citizenship. So basically, if you can't have babies, then the population is not going to grow. So incidentally, my great-grandfather actually lived in the US around the turn of the 20th century, but he had to return to China to actually have a family. And eventually he gave up on the US permanently and went back to China to fight for the right to vote there, since it wasn't going to happen in the US. In 1922 and 23, the Supreme Court explicitly ruled that those of Japanese and Asian Indian descent were also ineligible to become US citizens because they were not white. The Immigration Act of 1824 essentially restricted immigration from all the other Asian countries. And finally, in 1943, the Magnuson Act repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act, and they allowed immigration, but only about 100 immigrants per year. So it wasn't until 1952 that Asians were allowed to become naturalized citizens, although there were still very restrictive immigration quotas still in place. Likewise, Latinx people who were primarily from Mexico during this period that we're talking about had similar issues in becoming citizens. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 granted US citizenship to Mexicans who were living in the land ceded by Mexico to the US. But they did not address future immigration to the US until 1897, when a court case concluded that Mexicans, but not necessarily those from other Latin American countries, were eligible to naturalize. But then again, in the 1930s, hundreds of thousands of Mexican Americans were repatriated to Mexico. An estimated 60% of those repatriated were actually birthright citizens, and many more could have been naturalized citizens. So this repatriation essentially stripped them of their citizenship. And then, of course, the Jim Crow laws targeted towards Blacks also affected those with Mexican heritage. But this right to become citizens and to vote was not just restricted to immigrants. So the rights of Native Americans to become citizens and to vote is much more complex than it should be. So in 1856, the Attorney General at the time stated that Indians are subjects of the United States and therefore are not in mere right of home birth citizens of the United States. So they're subjects of the US, not citizens. And the Supreme Court ruled that they could become citizens through naturalization. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 confirmed this, that Native Americans who retained their tribal ties were not to be considered US citizens. And this sentiment continued in the 14th Amendment. In 1884, the Supreme Court ruled that Native Americans did not automatically become American citizens even if they relinquish their tribal allegiance. So finally, in the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 granted citizenship and the right to vote to all Native Americans. However, once again, the state stepped in and passed laws effectively barring Native Americans from voting based on criteria such as residency. So if you lived on a reservation, they didn't consider you a resident of the state, and taxation. So if you were not required to pay taxes, state tax, then you also could not vote. So these laws began being dismantled in 1948, with the last state allowing Native Americans the right to vote was in 1962. So there's one last group of US citizens who are largely minorities who still can't vote for president. And these are the people who live in the US territories. So the residents of District Columbia were granted the right to vote for president in 1961, even though they still don't have representation in Congress. However, the residents of Puerto Rico, Guam, America Samoa, and the US Virgin Islands are all US citizens, but they cannot vote for president and do not have representation in Congress. So as citizens, they have US passports, and they are free to establish residency on the mainland. And if they do, they can re-register and vote. And even if they move abroad, they can vote. So just the same, if you were born in Texas, grew up in Texas, you did your undergraduate here at Baylor, then you decide to go to Puerto Rico for medical school and set up residency there, you still will not be able to vote. So I know that today we're supposed to be celebrating the 19th Amendment, and which should have established universal suffrage in the US, since it had essentially doubled the number of eligible voters. But I got the role of being Debbie Downer, and have been talking about the people who couldn't vote despite the passing of the 19th Amendment. But there's hope in sight, and Dr. Henry will talk more about that.
Thank you. So what I would like to do is to first of all establish that we are celebrating today the ratification of the 19th Amendment, because anyone who cares about democracy is excited when it is extended. But with the passage of the 19th Amendment, the right to vote was not extended to all women. And even as the 19th Amendment was being passed, the right for suffrage was even being taken away from African American men, even as it was not extended to African American women. So we have the passage of the 15th Amendment, certainly, but we also have the end of Reconstruction after the Civil War, and then we have the implementation of Jim Crow, those laws across the southern states especially, which essentially disenfranchises African American men and women across the South. And so now, after the passage of the 19th Amendment, we have another law, and that is the law that we are also celebrating. So in August of 1965, we have the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And this is an act that does extend the right to vote to African Americans in the United States. So that is why, even though we had the passage of the 15th Amendment, we needed the Voting Rights Act. Now, there were key provisions in the Voting Rights Act of 1865 that were essential. So it bans things like the literacy test. It bans, well, actually, it's later that it also bans poll taxes, but it implements something, and that is that it implements federal oversight of voter registration in a lot of the southern states that had long-standing records of discrimination and violence against African Americans who would seek the right to vote. And that law gets passed, and across the South, we have many African Americans who can now register and vote. And at the same time, we see an exponential growth in the number of African American men and women holding elected offices. Now, that provision in the Voting Rights Act that becomes so vital is known as Section 5. And it is the pre-clearance requirement. And what that does is it requires southern states and some counties in the north, a handful, who have longstanding histories of discrimination against African Americans who are attempting to vote, to have any policies, laws that they want to implement regarding the right to vote before the federal government, and those have to be pre-cleared. But in 2013, after the Voting Rights Act had been reauthorized time and time again since 1965, the United States Supreme Court essentially gutted the Civil Rights Act, because now these states that have had histories, and by histories, let me help you to understand that we mean history as in day before yesterday, literally day before yesterday, that recently. We don't mean 10s and 20 years ago, who had these histories of discriminating against voters. And to show you what the removal of Section 5, or really the declaration that Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional, did, within 24 hours of the United States Supreme Court removing the pre-clearance requirement, the state of Texas put into place the harshest voter ID laws, among other laws, that are essentially voter suppression. And so those were laws that had been knocked down by several courts all the way up to the appeals court. And the case against the state had been one suggesting that its voter ID law was unconstitutional. And so now we have a Voting Rights Act, but one that has been essentially gutted. And we see across the South, and not necessarily only in the South, laws that are designed to suppress the vote. So all of that to say that, yes, there is hope in the sense that we have in our country passed laws that allow the expansion of the right to vote, but also to show us that the struggle for the right to vote is ongoing. So I hope that gives you a sense of where we are in terms of hope, and also in terms of where we need to continue to go.
Thank you, Dr. Henry. I've asked our panelists now to, we've covered a lot of ground here. And again, I want to encourage you to submit your questions for Q&A, because we're going to get to Q&A in about 15 minutes. We've covered a lot of ground, but I've asked each panelist to think a little bit. We've looked back for a period of time as we've thought about the passage of the 19th Amendment, the continuing struggle for suffrage. One of the biggest political movements of the time that we're in right now is non-voting. Those that do have the right to vote, or could have the right to vote, either not registering or participating in the political process. So I've asked each of our panelists to come back in the order in which you met them. So Dr. Turpin will be first. And I'd like for them to address from their perspective, and perhaps through the lens of some things that they've shared, what does it mean to use the vote now? The significance of that right of exercising the franchise. I would like each of them to just share a few minutes on that thought. And so we'll start with Dr. Turpin.
Hello again, everybody. I became an American historian in part because I wanted to communicate to my students that the way the country is now, the way that we just assume, well, this is just the way things are, is actually the result of choices by the citizens of the United States, and that they are citizens of the United States, and that the way the country is going to look in the future is actually going to be the result of their choices. It's not just a thing that's there that they live in the middle of. So, one of the reasons that we need to study history, so shout out for studying history, reading history books, attending panels such as this, but also the reason that we need to vote is so that we can reflect on the way things are, and we have to fight to keep the good and fight to change the bad. If there's something about the country that you like, and Dr. Henry just made this point, that it's not always going to be there. Right? We have to actually actively preserve the things that we value that are there. And we have to be reflective about, this isn't the best way for it to be. Maybe this is not in keeping with the ideals of our nation, and we can fight to change it. And that is part of the ideals of our nation. The ideal is that we are a democratic republic. So it is the people and our activism and our vote that shapes the nation, that keeps the good, that changes the bad. And I know that it can feel overwhelming in a country, particularly of our size, particularly on national issues. If it's raining, if there's COVID, right, why should I get out in November and cast a vote? And so I want to close my thoughts by looping back to the 19th Amendment and telling the story of what one person's action, what a difference that can make. So the way that you pass an amendment to the US Constitution is that the House passes it, the Senate passes it, and then 3/4 of the states have to ratify it. At that time, in 1920, 3/4 of the states was 36 states. And in what sounds like somebody made this up to make a good novel, but actually happened, every state had voted how they were going to vote, and then the remaining states, it was clear how they were going to go, and it came down to one swing state. If this state didn't ratify the 19th Amendment, it would not be ratified. That swing state was Tennessee. And suffragists knew how all of the voters were supposed to vote, how they had come forward and said they were going to vote, all the representatives of the state of Tennessee at the Tennessee legislature, and they were going to be one vote short. Literally the lack of one vote in one state could kill the 19th Amendment. The day the vote was held on August 18th, 1920, in the state legislature of Tennessee, one man changed his vote from what was expected, from no to yes. He did it because on August 17th, 1920, the day before, he got a letter from his mother. The man's name was Harry Byrne, and the mother's name was Feb Byrne. She was a widow. She ran a farm, so obviously a strong woman who knew what life was about. And she wrote her son, who was a representative in Tennessee, and said, hey, I haven't heard how you're going to vote yet. What's the deal here? I encourage you to vote. Help out Mrs. Cat, that was the name of the woman who was the head of NASA at the time, with her rats. Is she the one who put rat in ratification? Ha, no more from Mama this time. Love, Mama. And so Harry got this letter from his mother encouraging him to side with Carrie Chapman Catt and NASA and pass the 19th Amendment, and he changed his mind. Now, he had favored it, but his constituency were split and he didn't want to be the deciding vote. But he let his mother influence him in terms of how he was going to vote. And here's a quotation here from him at the end briefly. He said, I knew that a mother's advice is always safest for a boy to follow, and my mother wanted me to vote for ratification. And he gave that as one of his reasons for changing his mind. So one woman who wrote one letter when she could not vote yet influenced one man who had one vote, and that was the thing that put it all over the edge. So you and your one vote, or your one bit of activism, even outside of using the vote, can make a huge difference for the country. And I will pass it on to Dr. Henry.
So there are two things that I want to say. The first thing is, I always ask people to consider why it is that those who have fought against others' right to vote have done so. There must be something that is important, impactful, and empowering about the right to vote. Why then would so many people fight to keep it just for themselves and not for others? So I think it is important to think about that, to think about why the doors of suffrage have not been thrown open for everyone to participate. What is it about that ability that others want to keep only for themselves? The second thing I want to say is that our country is a country of laws, from the local to the state to the federal level. That is how our lives are conducted in the United States. And I ask each individual to think about allowing someone other than yourself to control your life. Think about what happens at the local school board. That is determined by the school board in your district. Are you concerned about what the school board is doing about your child's school? Think about what goes on in your city. That is controlled by the city council. The city council decides when and how your trash gets picked up, where it is dumped, where it is not dumped. The commissioner's court, the state government, and the national government all affect your everyday lives. And as we can see during the pandemic, all of these levels of government have impacted our literal lives. And so I say to you this, your vote is your superpower. I want you to use it. It has the ability to change not only your life, but the ability to change the lives of those who come after you. That is what those suffrage who worked to get the 19th Amendment passed. That is what those men and women who worked to get the Voting Rights Act of 1965 passed did. They planted trees under which they never got to sit. They are now depending on you to do the same thing. So again, your vote is your superpower. I need you to use it. And now I'd like to pass it on to Dr. Chan-Park.
So I'm going to take a much more practical sort of point of view about voting and exercising your right to vote. Register to vote. That's the first thing. Today's National Voter Registration Day. If you haven't registered, register. If you've moved, re-register. Know whether you're eligible to vote by mail if you're concerned about actually going to the polls. Find out what the rules are and follow them very, very closely. Use trusted sources, like, you know, you watch TV and, you know, some celebrities, like, I made a website and it tells you all the rules. Just go straight to the Secretary of State. Go straight to the county elections office website. Our county actually has one of the best election websites in the state. It's been, the League of Women Voters goes through and it actually evaluates every single county and the election information that they give out, and ours gets an A every single time. Remember that your vote counts, as has been mentioned. There are a lot of elections that are just determined by a handful of votes. Remember that regardless of who you vote for, the person who is elected is still your representative. You should still write to him or her and tell him or her what your views are on issues. Regardless of whether you voted for the person or not, they still are supposed to represent you. So know where to vote, make sure you bring your ID, be an informed voter. So the League of Women Voters puts out, it used to be in paper, we still have paper and PDFs, voters guides. Now it's online at Vote 411. Don't just vote in the big election. So don't just vote for the president and senator, maybe your representative. Go vote all the way down, because as Dr. Henry said, these down ballot races affect our lives. And especially this year, the city of Waco is having their election in November because it was postponed from May. Sample ballots are already available, but just make sure, bring your choices on a piece of paper. You're not allowed to use your phone or have your phone out once you enter the building to vote. Another thing to remember, to be active, is fill out your census form. And I don't know if there are many students on listening right now, but Baylor students are considered residents of Waco for census purposes. Even if you're not voting in Waco, for census purposes, you're considered a resident of Waco. It determines redistricting and also determines funding for a number of vital services. And sort of just for this year, if you're worried about, the pandemic and coronavirus when you go out to vote, If you're eligible to vote by mail, vote by mail. Ask for your ballot early. You'll get it earlier. You can mail it in earlier. They've extended early voting. You can actually go, this is the kind of nerd I am, you can actually go into the county elections website and look at all the past election results. And they will list how many people, like how many ballots, mail-in ballots were received on any given day. They will put how many people actually showed up and voted at each polling location. So from the 2016 election, 4 years ago, so the Waco First Assembly of God, that big church on Bosque, had an average of 1,600 voters per day early. But on Sundays, it only had 473. So that's a quarter of the people showing up to vote that day. You can also see for actual election day, because some people have this thing, they want to vote on election day, which is fine. It's the same thing. The Assembly of God Church had over 1,500 people vote there. Waco High, 2 miles away, 5-minute drive, not even 2 miles, only had 300 voters. So the church will have more machines, but they're not going to have 5 times as many machines, even though they generally will get 5 times as many voters. So wear a mask, have your ID ready. If you have a disability, you can request to be moved to the front of the line, or you can call a number and or send somebody in, and they'll actually bring out a voting machine to your car. And make sure you know who you're going to vote for beforehand, because it just means you'll spend less time in the booth, because you won't be deciding when you're there. And keep in mind that this year is the first year that we don't have straight party voting in Texas. So you actually have to individually pick each person. And don't forget to wear a mask. So my practical advice for voting this year.
Thank you, Dr. Chan-Park, and Dr. Henry and Dr. Turpin as well. While what you don't know is while you've been speaking, we've had some great questions that have been submitted that will fuel our discussion now as we move into Q&A section. There's still time if you've got questions, burning questions that you'd like to ask our panel. So feel free to use Q&A that should be below me right now. Click on Q&A and submit your question that direction. I look forward to receiving it. As we move into Q&A, I want to thank our sponsors one more time for the event. The W.R. Pogue Legislative Library, particularly Director Mary Goolsby, for sponsoring the event, the Institute for Oral History, Women and Gender Studies, Dr. Lisa Shaver, who's in the room, thank you for sponsoring this event, and of course, Waco NAACP. Dr. Peaches Henry, thank you for sponsoring this event through Waco NAACP as well. As I said, some great questions, so I hope you guys are on your toes because we've really got some good questions, and I'm going to start with this one. What about that amendment that doesn't have a number by it, the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment? Because we've seen in recent years, those that have paid attention at the state level, some renewed activity around the Equal Rights Amendment. So we have a question, do you think that needs to be restructured since its original ratification, since so much time has passed and the landscape has changed? What does the panel think about the passage of the ERA or the prospective passage of the ERA?
I'll give a little bit of historical background and then throw it to others since that's my jam. So the Equal Rights Amendment was first proposed by Alice Paul, who is the radical end of the white suffragists from the 1910 to 1920 phase. And so she was the one who starved herself in prison to picket, after picketing in front of the White House for women to have the right to vote. And it was a very brief stated proposed amendment that said that you can't pass any laws that discriminate on the basis of sex at all. And some women opposed this amendment because at the time there were laws that they had gotten sympathetic judges and legislatures to pass, say, maximum hour laws for women workers that they weren't yet willing to pass for men workers. And if you couldn't have any discrimination by sex, then those benefits that had been fought for women workers would go away. And so there was a debate even among women about, while it's a great principle, in practice, it would undo some things that actually protected women. But that was back before we had universal minimum wage, maximum hour laws, and various reforms in health and safety conditions for workers that came later. When the ERA was put forward for ratification in the 1970s, a group of women, a different type of group of women, opposed it again, this time on the basis of being afraid that that would take away some of the privileges that they believed that women had by being different. Alimony, the right not to be drafted for war, different things of that ilk. And so there was a debate about whether that would or would not actually, and is this good for women to have no discrimination in laws, or do women need certain kinds of protective laws because they are in fact physically different from men? And it became a whole debate all over again. And so it became enough of a debate that it stopped. It didn't pass. So it came down to the last few states, and unlike the 19th Amendment, it didn't make the hurdle. And so this means, though, that you're in a condition where any law that's passed that grants equal rights to men and women could also be unpassed because it's not enshrined in the Constitution. So that remains a debate about whether that kind of a amendment at the federal level would actually be a good way to protect women, or whether it would potentially remove other legal options for protecting women. So it remains a debate.
All right, that's a great question. Thank you, Dr. Turpin, for framing that. And that's an interesting question to continue to deal with, what the future of the ERA might hold for us. I have a great question from a student. I'm so glad that she asked this question. As a student, when talking about women's rights, other students my age say that we have just as many rights as men today and are even overcompensated in today's time. How do I address this? So this is from a student perspective. How do I address this and bring to light the reality of today's situation in a way that they can understand? So a great question, and I think she's asking women who have thought about this issue. And so I would appreciate any answer you could give our student.
Well, I think that she can start by talking about the wage gap, which continues to exist for women. For all of us, the lack of economic equality will affect all of our lives. So, for example, the fact that a woman makes less money, and of course we're talking in the aggregate here, we realize that, but the fact that women have to work through about August to the following year to make up for what they don't get in terms of what men do get, that will affect the amount of their retirement. It will affect the amount of their savings, and that will also affect their health, because they will have to work longer in order to maintain that their livelihood, and the list goes on. So I would say to young women to point to those areas in which we are not, first of all, we're not equally compensated, and then we are certainly not overcompensated in those areas. I would also look to, for example, the percentage of women in leadership positions in everything, in education, in business, in politics, and the list goes on.
Part of the compensation, you'll notice that fields, if they switch from being primarily male to primarily female, or vice versa, that the pay sort of
That's true.
Changes, right? So if at one point men were teachers and women were not, and that has shifted, and now teachers are grossly undercompensated, proportional in the way they were than when men were primarily teachers. And there's still a lot of unequalness in, just like you said, women in leadership. Even if you look at your professors, right? There are still departments in Baylor that might only have one woman. I'm not sure. I think maybe all of them have one woman. Maybe not all of them have a tenure or a tenure track woman in them. But even in a field like biology, where more than half of the PhDs are women that are produced, in the country, right, there's nowhere near half of the faculty are women. So they can't say it's a pipeline issue, right? So there's definitely still discrimination going on. It just might be more subtle. You might not see it in in your classes as much, because I mean the population at Baylor the student population is more female than male. Yeah.
So just to affirm what they've said and to sort of conclude it, the early women oftentimes pushback against what women have as much rights or they're overcompensated comes from a set of people who understand there to be certain differences between men and women, and they value their identity as women or men and some of the traits that they associate with that. And I would say, if that's your position or the position of the people that you're talking to, it's all the more important that women be at the table, right? That women have leadership positions because they're bringing a unique perspective. And even people who don't believe that there's necessarily really profound differences between men and women do believe that we all have different experiences by virtue of being men and women. And we need to have those experiences pooled at the table of decision-making together. And the final thing that I would throw out there that is not on the radar of college students as immediately is the issue of maternity leave. The one big physical difference between men and women is that women have children, are able to give birth. And that creates challenges for having women at the table in all kinds of different fields. And so the United States is actually quite far behind other nations in what we provide for maternity leave. So we have 6 weeks, sorry, that's guaranteed. You can get another 6 more unpaid, but it's like, this is really low level amounts of stuff when you're recovering from a pregnancy. Other countries have up to like a year at 80% pay that's guaranteed, and it keeps women in the field. And it's their commitment to saying it matters both to have women at the table, and it matters to provide time for men and women to invest in newborns and form those family bonding experiences and invest in the thriving of the next generation that will continue our country forward. So that's an area in which the United States still could see a lot of progress.
Thank you so much. To think about, again, the range of the way this issue presents itself, we can talk about discrimination, and we can talk about ongoing challenges. One of our participants asked this question that talked about how women have gone from being denied suffrage to being such a sought after group by politicians today, and women have become very influential in modern elections. And the participant asked that question: why do you think, each of you, if you have ideas on why women have become so influential in the modern election system?
From the perspective of an African-American woman, I would say this: African-American women vote. And they vote because they make a connection between their daily lives and their vote. And I would say that generally as women manage the household budget, they care for children, they care for the next generation or the previous generation. So I and my friends are currently in what is known as the sandwich generation. And that is the generation that is both taking care of its own children and its parents. And so the people who do that caring are generally women. And when we talk about the lack of equality for women, consider how many women versus men are caring for the previous generation. So I happen to know that among all of my friends, male and female, there is not a single male in my friend group or my age group who is a man who is doing that care for the previous generation. And I say this as a woman who has brothers, and in my own family and in the families I see. So that's how I see that situation.
All right, thank you, Dr. Henry. Another question that I think is interesting, and Dr. Chan-Park, I'll ask you to address this first, perhaps. Why isn't voting controlled by the federal government instead of the states? Talking about kind of the randomness of state-controlled voting process for federal elections. Just maybe thoughts you have and other thoughts the panelists have.
I think part of the reason why states have such a large role in voting is because you actually vote for a lot more state level offices than you do for federal. So federal, you have your 2 senators, your president and vice president, which are sort of combined now, right? And your state representative. So it's 4.5, right, people that you're voting for. Whereas at the state level, you're voting for your state board of education, you're voting for the governor, you're voting for your state representative, you're voting for your state a senator, and then in Texas, you also vote for your judges, lots of judges. So you vote for the appeals judge and you the district court judge. And often, especially with the judges, once they're an incumbent, they don't leave very often. So, which is also why they have mandatory retirement ages for the judges. So in McLennan County this year, you know, in the primary, that was a big thing, was because there were 4 people running for the judgeship. And if you didn't vote in the primary, that was it, because nobody was voting on the Democratic side, because generally only Republicans vote. Because where we are, the Republicans tend to get the vote for judge, so people don't even bother. But that's all these other all these other positions that you're voting for. So I think that's one reason why the states, and then it's always sort of that balance between state rights and federal rights that has been continuous since the founding of the nation. Yes, it's confusing, but generally you're only living in one place, so you only need to learn how it's done where you are. It's just every time you move to a different state, you need to learn what the new rules are, but the actual things you're voting for are going to be different from state to state. So I live someplace where we actually had a vote for the county surveyor, right? There were only 6 people in the county that actually qualified to be county surveyor, but we still had a vote.
Thank you, Dr. Chan-Park. Dr. Henry, did you have some thoughts on that? How about you field my next question, Dr. Henry? This question is response to something you particularly talked about in your talk. Current voter suppression, practical ways to alleviate or to address barriers that exist, continue to exist to voter suppression, just ideas you might have on that.
I have ideas because, we have history with this. So at a certain level, these are not new tactics. And because they're not new, African Americans and other people of color have learned to cope with them. So the voter ID situation, one of the things that the NAACP was to go to court. Now, we were unsuccessful in completely overturning the requirement for voter ID, but we were able to mitigate some of the most suppressing aspects of the voter ID law. So for example, these are things that we were unable to undo. While students could not use their voter IDs to vote, people who had gun licenses could use their IDs to vote. But what we were able to mitigate is that even though we live in a car culture state, not everybody has a car, surprisingly, and therefore not everybody has a driver's license. And so we were able to expand the list of what is considered acceptable ID. So, I say that as an example of how we've learned to mitigate some of these issues. Right now, we're in the middle of a pandemic, but yet people are being forced to go to the polls anyway. So we've also taken that issue to court and got some of it mitigated. So people who are concerned about COVID because they have underlying issues can now vote by mail. So they can request a ballot to vote by mail. So if they are compromised, and this is from the Texas Supreme Court, there are aspects of a person's health that will allow her to vote by mail. In addition, we remind people that there is curbside voting. So if you are uncomfortable, anxious about going into a vote center, then you can call and have a worker come out to you. So we are used to mitigating these attempts. So even as we are fighting them, we are also continuing to encourage people to vote. And so we provide people information so that they know what IDs that they need to vote. And then we continue to fight against these means. So I always tell people what we've known, and that is that people do not give up power, and voting is power, and we must recognize that. And that means that we're going to be in a constant struggle, but these are not new tactics. And because they're not new tactics, we have ways of fighting them. The one thing that people should not do, and that is people should not become cynical. They should not throw up their hands in despair because they are not fighting alone. You have people who are with you, and your vote has power, so you keep using it. And that is, people want us to give up. And we cannot give up, and we cannot become cynical. And we can never, ever, ever think that our single vote doesn't matter. If it didn't matter, people would not be trying to take it away from you.
Thank you, Dr. Henry. That's a good transition to, I'm going to collapse two questions that were asked by students. And these have to do with not necessarily cynicism, but apathy. Problems they have with friends that aren't passionate enough about a political issue to make them engage in the political process, or have a belief that their vote does not matter based on some idea they have of electoral college. And so I would just ask, and Dr. Henry, you just did that. If you have other thoughts, you can share them, but I would like the three of you to give me your elevator speech, your motivational elevator speech. And this can be related to what you've shared or just who you are and what you know about the importance of the vote. One of the things we really wanted to do here that I want to compliment all the panelists on, it's really hard these days to have a mutually edifying, nonpartisan discussion. I want to thank my panelists for crafting that here for us. But as this last question, I want you to address and just give your elevator speech on those that are dealing with that issue, perhaps of apathy or feeling that their vote really doesn't matter.
I'll start. One of the natures of American political culture right now is that it's highly divided. And so if you do not find yourself on the strong right or the strong left, you can sort of throw up your hands and be like, I don't like any of this, right? And I would say a few things. One, to echo what Dr. Chan-Park and Dr. Henry have said, there's a lot of down ballot races. So there's a lot of local races where the divisions aren't necessarily, like they are running as a Democrat or a Republican or an independent often, but it's not about that often at different levels of government, lower down. So actually get to know the issues and the people, and you'll find that there's probably something there that will engage you, and it does impact your life. And also, it is acceptable, and there is a robust tradition within American history to register your protest about all available options by voting third party. And that means that politicians can't say you just stayed home because you don't care ever. It means you care enough that you went out and said, give me something different. So I guess I would challenge you on those two fronts.
I would say, from my personal experience, don't vote the way that I vote because the person will not get elected. I mean, no matter what year, so if you're a betting person, don't bet on my candidate. They generally don't win. but that hasn't, that just because my person doesn't win does not mean that I need to give up, right? Because I need to say that the people that I do want to win have certain issues, and even if they're not elected, I can still write my representative and tell them, well, this issue is still important to me, regardless, right? I would say that your vote does matter, and look at all the issues. Don't become a one issue voter, right? You're never going to agree with everybody 100%. You have to decide which things are important to you, how much they are important to you. And it's all about compromise, right? The political process is about compromise, give and take, give and take. But if you don't get your voice out there, you will never get. And that's what your vote is.
Okay, so if you are attempting to talk to a person who says, oh, I don't vote, or I think my vote does not count, here are some things that think you need to consider. Consider what is important to that person. Voting is a very personal thing, and we have to connect the vote to something that a person cares about. So, example, for a parent of a person who is between 18 and 26, do you care about keeping your child on your insurance? These kinds of very practical things. Do you care about climate change and the environment? Do you care about you yourself, who is a young teacher who has to either teach online or who might actually have to go into the classroom? The people who control those decisions in your life are politicians. And so decide if you want to have an impact on those. Understand that local elections are decided by a handful of people who decide to go to the polls. I know that in school board elections, they are decided by 300 to 400 people. We have that many people at church on a given Sunday at my church. So these elections can be altered by your vote. And so I would say engage people where they are. Don't have these highfalutin and conversations with them. Have small, everyday conversations with them so that they can begin to see the impact of elections on their lives. And then finally, I would say this. We have to be careful about thinking about elections as entertainment. And people who are running for these offices as celebrities. These are public servants who must do a job for us at every level. So you don't have to love the person who's doing the job. What you have to do is decide whether the person will do the job that he or she is running for in the interest of you and the rest of the citizens in your town, in your state, or in your country. So talk with that person about how she wants the country to move forward, and then ask her to base her vote on that. It is indeed not a popularity contest. It is a contest for how our daily lives will be shaped by politicians on a daily basis. So remember, your vote's your superpower. Use it.
Thanks so much for those thoughts sharing. And of course, we did it today on National Voter Registration Day because we want to make sure you have time to get registered. So when the elections do come around, you can exercise that vote. I want to thank my three panelists today. One of the things you can do for that apathetic voter is you can share the video of today's presentation, today's webinar. It's going to live on that landing page that you signed on from, Baylor.edu/library/19. So the recording of today's session will live up there, and there's other resources that can be pointed to up there as well that might be useful to you. I do want to thank my panelists again. I would encourage you, wherever you are, to stand up and clap. You know, they can imagine you doing that. There's no feedback they're getting right now on how great a job they did, but I will thank them again for such a great job in accomplishing really what we wanted to do with this panel. Dr. Christina Chan-Park, thank you for participating in today's panel. Dr. Peaches Henry, for your contributions to today, and Dr. Andrea Turpin. Thanks to all of you for attending and signing on, and we will bid you farewell. And I'll let each of them pop on and say goodbye here at the end.
Goodbye, guys. Thank you so much for joining us. Remember, register and vote. Registration needs to happen before October the 5th.
Thank you, everybody. I would second it. Go and register, and you can check online at texas.gov as to whether or not you're registered.
And once again, it was great fun being here, and I hope you got something out of it. And if not anything else, go vote.
It's your right. Use it. Thank you.